I'm an avid solo traveler, and let me tell you, there's nothing quite like the thrill of hitting the open road with nothing but your backpack and the promise of new adventures ahead. This story is about one of those adventures I had while traveling across the United States in 2022. It's a tale that not many have heard, but those who have are always left with chills running down their spines. Several friends have heard about my encounters in the colorful Colorado area, especially the time I ran into a bear. A real fight for survival. But only a few know about the nights I spent on a trail in Arkansas that ultimately made me pack up and move my campsite. This is the story of one of those nights. It was late spring when I found myself crossing the mighty Mississippi River, leaving behind the Magnolia State. I had heard whispers of a remote campsite at the end of a dirt road deep in a cypress swamp in Arkansas. The thought of setting up camp in such a wild and untamed place excited me. I've always had a soft spot for the kind of rugged beauty that only nature can provide, and this swamp promised to deliver just that. The drive down that dirt road felt like a journey back in time. The trees grew denser, their gnarled roots twisting out of the ground like ancient guardians of the forest. Spanish moss draped from the branches, swaying gently in the breeze. As I ventured deeper into the swamp, the road narrowed, and I half expected to see an old shack or a hidden bayou around each bend. By the time I reached the campsite, the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the water. I quickly set up my tent, eager to settle in before darkness fell completely. My routine was the same as always: boil some water for my nightly mountain house dinner. This time beef stroganoff, thanks to the surplus my buddies Brandon and Raleigh had gifted me. The aroma of the meal mingled with the earthy scent of the swamp, creating a surprisingly comforting atmosphere. After dinner, I began preparing for bed. As I was securing the last of my gear, a sound caught my attention. It was a knock or maybe a pinging noise, echoing across the swamp. If you've ever spent a night in a swamp, you know it's alive with sounds. Frogs croaking, crickets chirping, otters splashing, and all sorts of animal calls. But this sound stood out. It wasn't necessarily scary, but it was distinct enough to make me pause. A few moments later, I heard a second knock, this time from a different direction. Then another knock, and another, forming a pattern. The sounds seemed to be coming from the murky waters surrounding my campsite. My curiosity piqued. I grabbed my flashlight and edged closer to the water, careful not to get too close. When you shine a flashlight across a swamp at night, you're often greeted by the reflective glint of countless eyes staring back at you. This time was no different, but the knocks continued, adding a layer of eeriness to the scene. I decided to return to my truck, thinking perhaps it was just my imagination running wild. But as I turned away, I heard the knock again, accompanied by what sounded like mumbling. The mumbling was faint, almost like a whisper carried on the wind. It was followed by another knock and mumble from a different location. The sound seemed to be moving around me, adding to the growing sense of unease. As I stood there, my mind drifted to stories I had heard about the Issaquena Dam back in high school, tales of mysterious creatures and unexplained phenomena. One of my favorite books as a kid was The Swamp Thing, and I suddenly cursed myself for ever reading it. Isolation, darkness, and unknown sounds can wreak havoc on the human mind. The knocking and mumbling continued, accompanied by occasional flickering lights. It could have been fireflies or some sort of swamp gas, but the sounds were undeniably real. I recalled previous encounters with what I believed to be Bigfoot, wondering if perhaps these creatures were curious about me. My more logical self tried to dismiss the idea, attributing the noises to unsavory swamp people going about their business. Either way, I knew I needed to leave. I decided it was best to move to a different campsite I had seen up the road. My truck setup made it easy to pack up quickly, and I didn't waste any time. I loaded up, hopped into the cab, and drove away, the unsettling vibe of the swamp lingering behind me. Once I found an alternate campsite and settled in, I tried to calm down, but sleep eluded me. The events of the night played over and over in my mind. As I left the swamp behind, I couldn't help but reflect on what had just happened. I've always prided myself on being brave and adventurous, but this experience had shaken me to the core. There's something about the unknown that can stir up a deep-seated fear, even in the most seasoned travelers. The next day, I decided to continue my journey across the state, heading towards the Ozark Mountains. The drive was beautiful, the landscape gradually changing from flat wetlands to rolling hills and dense forests. The air felt fresher, and the unsettling vibe of the swamp was slowly replaced by the excitement of new adventures. I spent the day exploring the quaint towns and scenic trails of the Ozarks. The people were friendly, and the scenery was breathtaking. There's a sense of timelessness in these mountains, a feeling that life here has remained unchanged for centuries. I hiked through lush forests, past crystal-clear streams, and up to stunning overlooks that offered panoramic views of the surrounding valleys. That night, I found a picturesque campsite nestled in a grove of pine trees. The scent of pine needles filled the air, and the sounds of the forest were a comforting symphony compared to the eerie silence of the swamp. I set up my tent, cooked another mountain house meal, and settled in for a peaceful night under the stars. As I lay in my tent, I couldn't help but think about the previous night's events. The knocks, the mumbling, the flickering lights. It all seemed like a bad dream, but the fear I felt was real. I realized that solo travel, while exhilarating, also comes with its own set of challenges. There's a thin line between bravery and recklessness, and sometimes it's hard to know when you've crossed it. Traveling alone has taught me a lot about myself. It's pushed me out of my comfort zone, forcing me to confront my fears and doubts. It's also given me a deeper appreciation for the world around me. There's a certain magic in discovering new places and meeting new people, in experiencing life in all its raw and unfiltered beauty. The next few days were a blur of exploration and adventure. I continued my journey through the Ozarks, hiking to hidden waterfalls, exploring ancient caves, and soaking in the natural beauty of the region. Each night, I found a new campsite, each one offering its own unique charm. One evening, I found myself at a campsite near a small lake. The sun was setting, casting a golden glow over the water. I set up my tent and cooked dinner, enjoying the peacefulness of the moment. As I sat by the campfire, I thought about the journey ahead. There were so many places I wanted to see, so many adventures waiting to be had. The next morning, I packed up and hit the road again, heading towards the Great Plains. The landscape changed once more, the rolling hills giving way to vast open fields that stretched as far as the eye could see. The sky felt bigger here, the horizon a distant line that seemed to go on forever. I stopped in a small town for lunch, the kind of place where everyone knows everyone. The locals were curious about my journey, asking me about the places I had been and the things I had seen. I shared some of my stories, leaving out the more unsettling details of my night in the swamp. Instead, I focused on the beauty of the places I had visited, the kindness of the people I had met along the way. That night, I found a campsite in a secluded area of the plains. The wind rustled through the tall grasses, creating a soothing melody. I set up my tent and prepared for another night under the stars. As I lay in my sleeping bag, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The sounds of the plains were different from the forest or the swamp. The wind howled, and distant coyotes called out to each other. I tried to convince myself that it was just my imagination, but the feeling of unease persisted. I listened intently, straining to hear anything out of the ordinary. Suddenly, I heard a rustling sound, followed by a low growl. My heart raced as I reached for my flashlight, shining it towards the source of the noise. Two glowing eyes stared back at me from the darkness. I froze, my mind racing with possibilities. Was it a coyote? A mountain lion? Or something else entirely? The creature stepped into the light, revealing itself to be a large dog, probably a stray. It looked at me for a moment before turning and disappearing into the night. I let out a breath I didn't realize I had been holding, the tension slowly leaving my body. It was just a dog, nothing to be afraid of. The next morning, I packed up and continued my journey. The encounter with the dog had shaken me, but it also reminded me of the unpredictability of solo travel. Each day brought new challenges and new experiences, and that was part of the thrill. I crossed the Great Plains, marveling at the vastness of the landscape. The endless fields of wheat and corn swayed in the breeze, creating a sea of gold and green. I stopped at small towns along the way, each one with its own unique charm and character. As I drove through Kansas, I couldn't help but think about the journey so far. I had faced my fears, pushed myself to the limit, and come out stronger on the other side. There were still so many places to see, so many adventures to be had, and I was ready for whatever lay ahead. One evening, I found myself at a campsite near a river in Nebraska. The sun was setting, casting a warm glow over the water. I set up my tent and cooked dinner, enjoying the peacefulness of the moment. As I sat by the campfire, I thought about the journey ahead. There were so many places I wanted to see, so many adventures waiting to be had. As the night grew darker, I began to hear strange noises coming from the river. At first, it was just a faint splashing sound, but it soon grew louder and more distinct. I shined my flashlight towards the water, but I couldn't see anything out of the ordinary. The splashing continued, accompanied by what sounded like whispers. I tried to convince myself that it was just the wind or some animals playing in the water, but the sounds were too deliberate, too human. My heart raced as I listened intently, the whispers growing louder. I couldn't make out what they were saying, but they filled me with a sense of dread. I decided to investigate, grabbing my flashlight and making my way towards the river. As I approached the water, the whispers stopped, replaced by an eerie silence. I shined my flashlight across the river, the beam cutting through the darkness. There, in the middle of the water, I saw a figure standing still, its eyes reflecting the light. I froze, my mind racing with possibilities. Was it a person? A ghost? Or something else entirely? The figure didn't move, just stood there, staring at me. I felt a chill run down my spine as I slowly backed away, the fear gripping me once again. I returned to my campsite, my mind filled with questions. What had I seen? Was it real, or just my imagination playing tricks on me? I tried to sleep, but the image of the figure in the river haunted my thoughts. I lay awake for hours, the whispers echoing in my mind. The next morning, I packed up and continued my journey. The encounter by the river had shaken me, but it also reminded me of the unpredictability of solo travel. Each day brought new challenges and new experiences, and that was part of the thrill. As I made my way through the Midwest, I couldn't help but reflect on the journey so far. I had faced my fears, pushed myself to the limit, and come out stronger on the other side. There were still so many places to see, so many adventures to be had, and I was ready for whatever lay ahead. Eventually, I made my way back home, my heart full of memories and my mind brimming with stories to tell. Solo travel had taught me so much about myself and the world around me. It had shown me the beauty and the danger, the thrill and the fear, the joy and the sorrow. As I look back on those nights in the swamp, the mountains, and the plains, I realized that they were more than just adventures. They were moments of self-discovery, of pushing beyond my limits, of embracing the unknown. They were the moments that made me who I am today, a traveler, a storyteller, and a lover of life's endless possibilities. I remember the first time I stumbled upon that secluded spot on the state land. It felt like discovering a hidden gem. That place, tucked away from the bustling world, was a sanctuary where my buddies and I could truly unplug and immerse ourselves in the beauty of the wilderness. Over the years, it had become our annual tradition, a week-long escape from reality filled with camping, swimming, and camaraderie. But little did I know that one summer, our beloved retreat would turn into an enigma that would haunt me for years. The drive to the campsite was always a journey in itself. It was located deep in the woods, a good 2-hour hike from the nearest road. As I navigated the winding trails, the dense canopy above filtered the sunlight into dappled patterns on the forest floor. The air was thick with the scent of pine and damp earth, and the only sounds were the rustling leaves and occasional bird calls. This time, I was the first to arrive, my truck laden with gear, ready for a week of roughing it with my closest friends. When I finally reached the familiar clearing by the lake, I was taken aback. Instead of the pristine, untouched landscape I remembered, there were already tents set up. My heart sank. Over the years, more people had discovered our secret haven, but I had never encountered anyone else camping there. It was disheartening to see our private paradise invaded. I parked my truck and approached the campsite cautiously. The tents were there, but there was an eerie stillness. I called out a greeting, hoping to find friendly faces, but there was no response. The place seemed abandoned, yet it felt like people had just been there. A campfire pit with charred logs, a few folding chairs scattered around, and even coolers with ice and beer still inside. My curiosity piqued. I decided to investigate further. The path to the lake was steep and narrow, and as I descended, I noticed debris scattered along the way. A sleeping bag, tools, and clothes lay strewn about, as if someone had hastily left them behind. The clothes were wet and muddy, suggesting they had been there for a while. But what struck me as odd was that the fire was out, yet the coolers still had ice. It couldn't have been that long since the campers had left. Returning to the campsite, I checked the tents. They were empty, but there was evidence of recent occupancy. Personal items, food supplies, even a couple of books. Everything seemed intact, just abandoned in a rush. It was unsettling. Why would anyone leave all their gear behind like this? I sat on a log, trying to make sense of it all. My mind raced with possibilities. Had there been an emergency? Had they gone for help? But if that were the case, why leave everything behind? The forest felt different, the usual sense of peace replaced by a subtle, creeping unease. My thoughts were interrupted by the sound of footsteps crunching on the gravel. My buddies, Tim and Jake, had arrived. I waved them over, and we shared confused looks as they took in the scene. "What's going on here?" Tim asked, his brow furrowed. "I have no idea," I replied, shaking my head. "It looks like they left in a hurry, but I can't figure out why." We spent the next hour exploring the area, hoping to find clues. The lake was serene and undisturbed, no sign of anyone having been there recently. We checked the surrounding woods, but there was no indication of where the campers might have gone. Maybe they got spooked by something, Jake suggested, his voice tinged with unease. Spooked by what? I countered. A bear? This stuff would be trashed if it was an animal. And there's no sign of a struggle or anything. As the afternoon wore on, we decided to set up our own camp nearby, but kept a close eye on the abandoned site. There was a strange, almost foreboding atmosphere that hung over the place, and it made us all a little jumpy. That night, as we sat around our campfire, we speculated about what could have happened. Theories ranged from wild animal attacks to more sinister possibilities, but none of them made much sense. The next few days passed uneventfully, but the mystery of the abandoned campsite lingered in our minds. Each morning, we half expected to find the original campers return to collect their things, but no one came. It was as if they had vanished into thin air. The longer their absence stretched, the more unnerving it became. On the fourth day, while fishing by the lake, I heard the distant hum of an engine. Moments later, a Department of Natural Resources (DNR) patrol boat appeared on the horizon. As it approached, I waved them over and filled them in on our discovery. The Rangers were just as perplexed as we were, but assured us they would investigate and collect the abandoned gear. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the campsite, the DNR Rangers arrived. They methodically packed up the belongings, taking notes and photographs. One of the Rangers, a grizzled veteran named Hank, pulled me aside. "You boys did the right thing, letting us know," he said, his voice gravelly and serious. "This isn't the first time we've come across something like this. Sometimes folks just get spooked out here, but usually they come back for their stuff. Do you think something bad happened to them?" I asked, unable to hide my concern. "It's hard to say," Hank replied, glancing at the now empty campsite, "but we'll do our best to find out." As the Rangers left with the gear, a heavy silence settled over the forest. The shadows seemed to lengthen, and the trees whispered in the wind. That night, sleep came fitfully, my mind racing with unanswered questions. Every summer, like clockwork, our school organized a spiritual retreat for students. Nestled in the heart of the Appalachian Mountains, Camp Serenity had been our annual escape for years. The camp, surrounded by a dense forest and a winding river, had a strange, timeless quality to it. The old, rustic cabins, ancient trees, and stories of the camp's mysterious past all contributed to an eerie atmosphere that both fascinated and unnerved us. In the 1800s, the nearby town had been the site of a brutal battle during a gruesome war that nearly decimated the area. The town had been rebuilt, but the scars of history remained. The camp itself was said to be haunted, with countless ghost stories and legends passed down from generation to generation of students. Some of the older structures at Camp Serenity had survived that fiery past, their charred remnants standing as silent witnesses to the horrors that once took place there. It was the summer of my senior year, the last camp we would ever attend together as a class. We arrived at Camp Serenity on a hot July afternoon, our spirits high despite the oppressive heat. The first day was a whirlwind of activities. Hiking through the dense forest, swimming in the cool river, and sharing ghost stories around the campfire. By nightfall, we were exhausted. Our dormitory was an old wooden cabin, long and narrow, with rows of bunk beds lining the walls. There were only 6 boys in our class, so we had the entire dormitory to ourselves. We chose the top bunks, arranging ourselves in a way that we could easily talk and joke with each other after lights out. That night, after dinner and a short campfire session, we headed back to our dorm. The moonlight filtered through the small windows, casting eerie shadows on the wooden floor. We settled into our bunks, the sounds of the forest outside a constant background noise. We lay there in the dark, talking and laughing, the excitement of the day slowly giving way to drowsiness. It must have been around midnight when we finally began to drift off. I remember lying in my bunk, listening to the gentle rustle of leaves outside, the distant hoot of an owl, and the soft breathing of my friends. Slowly, the conversation died down, and one by one, we fell asleep. I woke up suddenly in the middle of the night, a sense of unease washing over me. The dorm was pitch black, and for a moment, I couldn't understand what had woken me. Then I heard it, a soft, almost imperceptible rustling sound, like someone moving quietly through the room. I lifted my head and glanced over at my best friend, Jake, who was in the bunk opposite mine. He was also awake, his eyes wide and alert. He nodded towards the bunk next to him, where our classmate Tom was sleeping. I turned to look and saw a silhouette standing beside Tom's bed, staring down at him. At first, I thought it was a prank. I smiled and looked back at Jake, ready to go along with whatever joke he had planned. But before we could do anything, the silhouette crouched down, and I realized with a jolt that Tom was still lying in his bed, fast asleep. A cold shiver ran down my spine. Jake and I exchanged a look of pure terror, both of us silently praying that whatever it was wouldn't notice us. We pulled our covers up, hiding our faces, and lay there, frozen with fear. After what felt like an eternity, I must have drifted off to sleep again, though I don't know how. The next morning, the events of the night before felt like a distant nightmare. I went straight to Jake, and before I could say anything, he blurted out, "Did you see it?" He described exactly what I had seen, confirming that it hadn't just been a figment of my imagination. We decided to talk to Tom about it. Of course, he thought we were messing with him, but the look of fear in our eyes must have convinced him that we were serious. He didn't sleep well for the rest of the trip, and neither did we. For the remainder of our time at Camp Serenity, that sense of unease never left us. Every creak of the old cabin, every rustle of leaves outside, seemed charged with an otherworldly energy. We tried to enjoy the rest of our trip, but the experience had left a mark on us. As we packed up to leave on the last day, I took one last look at the cabin, its weathered wood glowing in the morning sun. Despite the fear and unease, there was a part of me that would always be drawn to the mysteries of Camp Serenity. The camp had given us one final, unforgettable memory, one that would bind us together long after we left. Back at school, life returned to its usual routine, but Jake and I often found ourselves revisiting that night in our conversations. We would talk about the silhouette, trying to make sense of what we had seen. As the years went by, the memory of that night became a shared secret, a bond between us that time couldn't erase. 7 years later, I found myself back in the town near Camp Serenity, now a bustling little community with new houses and businesses. Jake and I had kept in touch, our friendship enduring despite the miles between us. On a whim, we decided to visit the old campgrounds, driven by a mix of nostalgia and curiosity. We arrived at Camp Serenity to find it much the same as it had been, the old cabins standing proudly amidst the trees. The camp was deserted, as it often was during the off-season, adding to the eerie atmosphere. We walked through the familiar grounds, memories flooding back with every step. Standing outside our old dormitory, we both felt a strange mix of emotions. The fear we had felt that night was still palpable, but so was the bond it had forged between us. We entered the cabin, now dusty and abandoned, and stood in the same spot where we had seen the silhouette. "Do you think it was real?" Jake asked, breaking the silence. I shrugged, unable to find a definitive answer. I don't know, but whatever it was, it brought us closer together. As we left Camp Serenity, I realized that the place would always hold a special place in my heart. It was a reminder of the unknown, of the mysteries that life could throw at us, and of the enduring power of friendship. That night had changed us in ways we couldn't fully understand. It had taught us to face our fears, to rely on each other, and to cherish the moments we had together. And even though we would never know the true nature of the silhouette, it had given us a story that would last a lifetime. As we drove away from Camp Serenity, I looked back one last time at the old cabin, now just a shadow in the distance. The past had a way of holding on to us, but it was up to us to make peace with it and move forward. Jake turned to me with a smile. So, same time next year? I laughed, feeling a sense of closure. Yeah, same time next year. And with that, we left the past behind, carrying with us the memories and the lessons we had learned. The road ahead was uncertain, but we knew that whatever came our way, we would face it together, just as we had that night at Camp Serenity.